Welcome back to this series of interviews. In our next interview, we'll meet Professor Ger Fitzgerald, who will speak on the topic of fermented foods and their products and their influence on the microbiome and in turn on human health.
We've been consuming fermented foods for as long as there's been civilization, human civilization. Obviously, without having any awareness of the scientific basis of the fermentation. But fermented foods maybe predate recorded human history. The ancient civilizations of the Fertile Crescent would have known fermented foods, meats, and milk products, and so on. And it's only really in the mid 1800s that the scientific basis of fermentation and what that does came to be appreciated. So we've always been consuming fermented foods like cheese and various fermented meats and so on. They have become linked to a degree with good dietary practice in more modern times, and that is probably correct. So that would be my answer to that question. I suppose globally, yogurt and yogurt type products would be the most common because they're also perhaps the most easy to make. But we're all familiar with cheeses. Cheddar cheese would be the kind of Anglo type cheese that many of us in Ireland, England, the US, and so on would be familiar with. On the continent, Swiss type cheeses, Emmentaler, Gruyere. And then there are the more exotic ones like the very pungent, very heavily ripened cheeses, the smelly socks kind of smell that you get from some of these blue cheeses and surface ripened cheeses, as they're called. It's interesting, actually, when I checked up the numbers, we have gone from being a very low consumer in terms of kilograms per capita, right up to the top of the European League. We consume about 22, 23 kilograms of cheese per annum in Ireland. In the UK, which is culturally and societally quite similar to us, you'd imagine, that number is only 6 kilograms. So we consume about 3 times more cheese than our neighbours across the water, which kind of surprised me. If I'm forced to give a generalised answer, you could almost say yes. Any food, particularly vegetables, and in fact they are. If you go to the continent and go to Eastern Europe and Russia and so on, like carrots and cabbage and you name it, almost they can ferment. There's actually maybe when I'm teaching this stuff, you start with the scientific definition, which is the breakdown of organic compounds in the absence of oxygen, which is actually important in the scientific concept, to release energy. In food fermentation, then, if you want to bring it on, we exploit that capability to whereby we allow microorganisms to break down components of substrates, be it milk, be it meat, be it vegetables. And in milk, for example, famously, lactose is a fermentable carbohydrate, and there's about 5% lactose in milk. And certain types of microorganisms ferment the lactose, producing lactic acid. And that's the basis of dairy fermentation in particular. And that's obviously contributes to the preservation of the product as well. They're essential to the process, and for most food fermentations, the core group of microorganisms would be a group we call the lactic acid bacteria. And these are actually beautifully designed bacteria where they can very efficiently take a substrate like lactose, which in nature is quite a rare sugar, in fact. It's associated almost exclusively with mammalian milk. And they can convert lactose into lactic acid. And in this process, they release energy, which they can then capture to power all the cellular functions like growth and reproduction and so on and so forth. That's a very important point, and it's absolutely correct. Remember again, for most of human civilization, the scientific basis as we now know it just wasn't understood. People didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about lactic acid or lactose or any of these things. And fermentation was done in order to preserve a very perishable substrate, usually meat or milk and sometimes vegetables. But if you take, in the Middle East, where many of these fermentations might initially have originated. Ambient temperature, 25, 30 degrees. If you milk an animal, back then it was probably more likely goats and sheep and camels than cattle. But if you milk an animal and you leave the milk out at 25, you can imagine it'll go off very, very quickly. If you do a simple operation like adding some bacteria, a little bit of salt, a little bit of a coagulating enzyme that helps the curd to form, you produce a product that can have a shelf life for weeks, even months, depending on the nature of the fermentation and so on and so forth. So it is very much a preservation technology, maybe the original preservation technology where you go beyond simply salting food as they used to do as well. I'd have to say no. The evidence is that fermented foods are very, very popular. The amounts globally would be increasing. There's organic growth in it. If you look at the market surveys and all these numbers that come out every year from the various statistical agencies, you can see that cheese consumption, for example, is increasing. Fermented meats, maybe not so much. But refrigeration, remember also, is actually used to add further to the shelf life of fermented foods. When you buy cheese, when you buy fermented meat, you're asked to put it in the fridge as well. So it's a combination of the fermentation of itself will give you a very solid extension of shelf life and keep the food safe. But if you refrigerate, on top of that, you get an extra increase in shelf life. It's difficult to generalize, to give a simple yes or no. Like lots of these things, it's very, very, you can't really give a simple yes and no answer to that. What I would say is many fermented foods are nutritionally very, very good. If you take a cheese, there's high protein, there's minerals, vitamins, and it's taken as a very nutritious food. There are other foods where that may not be the case. You could have other additives like in fermented meats where you would have nitrates and nitrites, and the move here is that we need to be very careful about how much of these foods we actually consume. So the old mantra of moderation in all things certainly does apply. If you're asking, do fermented foods contribute in a kind of a probiotic type way, I'd say on balance, my answer generally would be probably no. Now there are some exceptions. You see some science relating to kimchi, for example, the more or less the Korean equivalent of sauerkraut. That there's a lot of work done there on the types of microorganisms and whether they get to your gut and your colon, and there is some evidence that they may have health benefits. But generally speaking, regular fermented foods to which probiotics have not been added, I think they don't really contribute to health beyond nutrition, good nutrition. Too much of anything isn't good for you. Many of these fermented foods do have high salt because salt is part of it. They also have higher levels of saturated fats, and again, we all need some saturated fats in our diets. We have to have it, but you have to be careful about how much of these things you actually do consume. So again, going back to the moderation thing is very, very important. Yes, absolutely. Diversity is key, I think. Dietary diversity. Clearly, I'm an advocate of fermented foods, and I've spent my life dealing with fermented foods there. But man cannot live on cheese alone, type of thing. So dietary diversity is absolutely essential for a healthy gut microbiota.